Welcome to Tanakh Talk. I am your host, William Hall, broadcasting live from Kingsland, Texas, USA, with another episode of Torah Talk Weekly Parsha with Rav Yitzchaq Michaelson from the Holy Land. This week we are going to be discussing all about PESACH. Welcome back. Don't smoke crack. Don't ask. It's something that's been in my head. I say it every once in a while and it just has to come out.
Okay. Gotcha.
But it's good advice, though. From what I've heard, that's really good advice. So,
very much so.
Welcome. Oh, I forgot to put my mask on. Where's that? Right here.
No, okay.
That's pretty good. You have to tell everybody about your...
I can't tell. No, I put this on because you can see I have a fancy one here because, believe it or not, this is made out of an old kippah. I saw a video on it, and so it's pretty cool. Not just for the head, you can wear them as a mask too. You just take the sides and fold them in, do a little staple with a rubber band, and they're lined on the inside, so they make great masks.
That's funny.
So anyway, that's just an idea for those of you that might have a kippah laying around, especially the lined ones. You don't want them too thick, but you see they have a lining on the inside.
Right.
And it's very breathable. You can hear me fine.
That's
cool.
I
look like kind of the Jewish ninja here.
That's
anyway,
funny.
We'll get rid of that because it's hard. It's hard with the.
I know.
With
I'm trying to do the same
my
thing.
My glasses fogging up while we're talking.
I'm trying to do the same thing with mine. So my daughter just brought. I can't get it positioned right. There you go. Just brought these. Now I got a mouthful. I'll forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, she brought these. It's not really a mask. It's more like a band, but it's like really tall and like you put it around and you cover your neck, keep your neck warm, or you can stretch it up over your nose. But it's used for people use it for bug masks as well. But turns out, I think in Austin they just made it a law that you have to, if you're in public, you have to wear an actual mask while you're walking in public. They will fine you up to $1,000 if they find anybody not wearing this mask, not following these laws. So. Anyway,
so it's been that way before Shabbat here, although it was a very frustrating Shabbat for me because, as you know, I have a dog, and so we're not supposed to go out here at all unless you are going out for food or you're going out for medication. You can obviously walk your dog, but you're not supposed to go more than a certain distance from the house. And then they came out with the new regulations, which required us to wear masks and gloves when you go out. And I did have to go out a couple of times. Usually Leah takes him out a few times, and if I have to, I go. So I had to take him out yesterday a few times. And it was very disheartening because it was very warm here. We started to get at least, it's not going to last. We're not really at the point yet where we have really warm weather. But we had a very, very nice day. It was very seasonal yesterday. I think it was 27, which is, upper 70s here, which is unusual for this time of year. So because it was that way, I experienced a situation where every single person that I encountered while walking my dog had nothing on. No gloves, no mask, no nothing. Really? They were walking around as if there was nothing going on. Everything's copacetic. And so our mayor actually posted last night after Shabbat that he was going to be increasing the presence of Mishtarah, of the police, and having more cars out on the street patrolling and making sure people are following the guidelines and if they're going to be out. And it's difficult because, as you mentioned, we're just a few days away from Pesach. Passover starts here Wednesday at sundown. We're talking on Sunday night, so people are really preparing, and it's difficult for a lot of people because, in a way, we always kind of look at these kind of. You and I often talk about dualities, or you could say a dichotomy, something that sort of seems opposite. And the question is, can we find good out of bad situations?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Especially what we're living through now. So we have to look at things always, as we say, from a physical standpoint, a spiritual standpoint. And I often hear the last couple of weeks, I was talking to Rabbi Katz about this earlier today on the phone, and we were chatting because he's a guy like me that likes to do a lot of research. And so I'll give you an example of one of the things that I found in my research on our particular situation with the coronavirus right now. You see a lot of people doing one or two things. You see people, and I'm talking about rabbis, I'm talking about respected people out there that are coming out and giving you all the reasons for why we're going through what we're going through. Now, personally, I don't think anybody has a clue as to the reason. Can you allude to potentially that we've been put in a situation where we need to make tshuva and draw closer to Hashem and call upon Hashem? 1,000%. I don't disagree with that. But for somebody to come out and say, I know for sure that this is why we're going through this, I don't buy it, even from a spiritual standpoint, even from a Torah standpoint. So that when I give you an interpretation or my opinion, it's just that I'm alluding to things because I'm always trying to take a physical situation and raise it to spirituality. Mm-hmm. So the second thing that I see is that people are posting all kinds of conspiracy theories. Oh, it was cooked up in a lab and this happened, and how come you don't see China's economy falling apart and all the other countries and people, all kinds of craziness. First of all, I don't believe a thing China says. That's number one. I don't believe they're giving you the real numbers. I don't believe anybody knows whether or not it is affecting their markets or not affecting their markets. I wouldn't trust anything that comes out of there. So here's what we know for a fact. And this is actually a mathematical mathematical formula that's used in as it relates to viruses. And it's not just viruses, but it's a mathematical formula that they've attached to different viruses, whether you're talking about SARS or you're talking about MERS. Well, that was weird. Getting some feedback.
Interesting. I don't know why. Can you do me a favor, real fast? Can you turn your microphone down some? Because it's
sure.
I should have asked you earlier, but
I'll move it away.
Okay.
Is that better?
Actually, the volume was so hot that whenever I turn that, when I get you up to loud, it sounds like it's clipping, but it's not clipping on my side. It just sounds distorted coming through.
Okay. So maybe that's better if I move it away a little bit.
I think it is better, actually. Yes, that's good.
Yeah. So this mathematical formula related to different viruses, like they've used this in determining how many people can become infected from another virus. So whether it's H1N1, whether it was the 1918 flu, the Spanish flu, the MERS, the SARS, any of those, even Ebola, they use what's called an R naught. An R, the letter R, and then naught would be like R0, 0 being naught. So what does R naught tell you? It tells you how contagious something is. So to give you an example of why I think conspiracy theories are crazy as it relates to this, and why people can't compare this to like the flu, for instance, and say, oh, the flu kills so many people. So to give you an idea, the H1N1 flu, which I think was like in 2009, had an R naught of between 1.2 and 1.6. That means for every person that was infected, 1.2 to 1.6 people were infected. Now, Ebola, which killed a lot of people, now it was contained and confined in Africa, but Ebola had an R naught of 1.6, between 1.6 and 2. That means for every person that was infected with Ebola, 1.6 to 2 people became infected because that person was contagious. SARS is between 2 and 4, an R naught of 2, between 2 and 4. That means on average, you would say for every person that was infected with SARS, 3 people would be infected. And then with MERS, it was really high. MERS could be anywhere from 2.5 to 7.2, meaning that, and then when you average it out, so you're talking about somewhere around 4 to 4.5 people for every person that was infected. Now we'll look at, so when we're talking about the flu is similar to the H1N1, which is more between a 1.2 and a 1.5. COVID-19 is a R naught of between 2 and 2.5. So it's somewhere around, for every one person that's infected, you're talking about 2 to 2.5 people are infected from it. So it's really much more contagious than the flu. So, and when you look at all of these other, I know we were going to talk about, trying to talk about Torah, but I want to give you sort of an understanding a little bit as it relates to this, and then we'll get into the Torah of this. When you look at the other numbers, so you look at something like Ebola that really only affected Africa, and it had a very high death rate, but there were only, maybe 34,000 cases, and it had a 40% fatality rate. You had like 13 to 14,000 people that died as a result of that. And SARS had like a 9.6%, and MERS had a 34%. But there were small cases, like MERS only had like 2,500 cases, and SARS was like 8,000 cases. Here we have COVID-19. You have over 1 million cases, and so far 54 or 55,000 people have died. So it seems low because it's only 5.3%. But when you look at the number of countries, Ebola only affected 9 countries, and SARS affected 29 countries, and MERS affected 22 countries. COVID-19 is 181 countries are affected by it. So I don't think you can really connect them. That's why I think it's that people need to be very careful as it relates to what they're listening out there today, what they're listening to, because they're hearing rabbis talk about, oh, this is the reason why we're suffering, and this is what you need to do. This is the solution. They don't know, and I don't think anybody should be saying that. And on the other hand, there are people that are giving you conspiracy theories and telling you, oh, it's not that big a deal. It's just like the flu. The flu kills more people. That's not true at all, because it's much more contagious than the flu. The flu, like I said, is contagious where it has an R naught of maybe 1.2 to 1.5. This is a 2 to 2.5. So in some cases, it can be twice as contagious as the flu. So there's my medical, and I'm not a medical expert,
Right.
but this is what I do. I research things because it bothered me that people were bringing these up. Now, we have the component here that we're also in the time of redemption, right? We're coming up to Pesach, and Pesach was definitely a time of redemption. So Bezrat Hashem, God willing, we will see redemption on Pesach. Is it possible that Hashem could bring Mashiach? Again, 100%. The problem that I see, and I've mentioned this several times in some of the shows that you and I have done, both here on Tanakh Talk and on our radio show that we do together, is that I just see people, between the conspiracy theories and how people are treating each other, attacking each other, Jews attacking each other publicly, people attacking each other, people of faith are either drawing closer to Hashem or they're being pushed farther away from Hashem. And then again, there will be people that will say to you, oh, I can tell you why, because people are, again, they'll give you reasons. I'm just saying that in this time of redemption, we can see some very interesting things. We can see some very interesting things in the Torah, in the Torah portion. Now, we don't follow the regular cycle of the Parshiot. Like, for instance, we would go from Tzav usually to Shemini, which it comes from Shmona, 8, related to the 8th day after the Kohanim are brought in to do their jobs, when Aaron, the Kohen HaGadol, and his sons now have been inaugurated into their positions after the 8 days of preparation. But we do read a particular portion on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach, Chol HaMoed being the intermediate days of Pesach. And because Pesach starts on Wednesday night, Passover, so on Shabbat, we read a special Torah portion, which comes from Ki Tisa, which comes from Ki Tisa, starts in Exodus chapter 30, but what we read is Exodus 33:12 to 34:26, which gives instructions about Chag Hamatzot, the festival of unleavened bread, and the idea of eating unleavened bread for 7 days, which, by the way, people don't often make the distinction between the two, that in essence, they are really two different holidays. Pesach is the Passover, which is the Passover offering that was brought for that one night. Like here in Israel, we only do one Seder. In what's called Chutz La'aretz, outside of the land, there are two Sedarim. There are two Seders. And the reason for that is because in the time of when the rabbis came up with these traditions and these halachot and these laws and what's called enactments or fences, what happened was, if you remember the history of this, Rosh Chodesh, when there was a new moon, what would happen was they would have witnesses that would go before the Sanhedrin who had seen the new moon, and these were trusted, very trusted men in Yerushalayim, in Jerusalem, that would go before the Sanhedrin, and they would say that the new moon had been sighted. And once they had these trusted witnesses come and say the new moon was sighted, they would light these fires from mountain to mountain. And from city to city, they would see that the fire had been lit, and they knew that Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, had been sighted, and Rosh Chodesh had started. Obviously, they didn't have the ability to do that outside of the land of Israel. It would take too long for that information to get to them. So what the rabbis did with certain holidays was they instituted a second day because they couldn't determine when it was exactly. Now we know in the modern days that it's possible that we do know because of all the technology we have and all the sciences we have and so forth. But because this was instituted, a change has not been made in that. So there are still 2 days. So what was I saying? I was saying that people don't often make the distinction that you have Pesach, you have the actual Passover that we're remembering when Hashem came through the angel of death and passed over the Hebrew slaves' homes, where the blood was placed on the doorposts of the house, the lintels and the doorposts. That was Passover. And then it says in Exodus chapter 33:12 through 34:25, we see that it says, and you shall keep Chag HaMatzot for 7 days. So you have this 8-day holiday, Passover being the first day, and then you have the 7-day holiday of Chag HaMatzot, of unleavened bread, where we're told we're not supposed to own or see any chametz, any leavening in our houses during that time. And then also within that Torah portion, we also have the what's called the Shalosh Regalim, the 3 festivals that are spoken about, which are Shavuot, and we have Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And Shavuot being Passover, we have the time of redemption. Shavuot related to the giving of it's the Feast of Weeks. We have the giving of the Torah on Shavuot, and then we have Sukkot, which the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Ingathering. Now, the interesting thing is the Haftarah, the Haftorah that's read for this Torah portion coming up on Shabbat Chol HaMoed Pesach is from Yechezkel 37, Ezekiel 37, which is the story of the dry bones. Why is that? Because we're talking about redemption. And when you talk about Sukkot being the Feast of Ingathering or the Festival of Booths, you also have the ingathering related to the redemption. Because at Sukkot, we're going to see, it says, we even have the Navi, Zachariah, talks about the end times and talks about basically that when nations rise up against Yerushalayim, against Jerusalem, that Hashem will come and do battle, and obviously Yerushalayim and Israel will be victorious. And it says that what will happen? All the nations will come up every year on Sukkot at that time. It's in the time of Mashiach, when Hashem places Mashiach as his king upon the throne in Israel. All nations will submit themselves and come up at the Feast of Tabernacles. So we see all of these three in this portion that's read on this Shabbat as well. Now, so I saw something very interesting. I see some interesting things in Kitisa, but I saw some interesting things related to this concept of the plague as well. Because one of the things that, and this goes back to what some of these rabbis are talking about, is this concept of the metzorah or tzara'at, which we talk about often, usually translated as leprosy. But we've talked about this on this show, and I'm sure other rabbis have probably talked about this as well. The idea of tzara'at, this skin disease, is said to not come from a physical condition, but actually from a spiritual condition. Why was that interesting to me? Because, again, talking about these dichotomies, the word that's often used for this kind of being stricken or having this kind of condition is the word negah in Hebrew. And negah is spelled with exactly the same letters as another word, which is oneg, which is delight. And if you remember, just a short time ago, I talked about this idea of having a situation that's bad and turning it into something that's good. How do we do that? So I thought it was interesting in looking at what a lot of people are saying about this condition and about being stricken by plagues and this idea of tzara'at and how it's always connected to the idea of lashon hara, this idea of speaking badly. And again, I talked about this idea that I see so many people continuing this and attacking each other. We have a group here in the town that I live in, a Facebook group, and somebody just made a benign post about eggs. Why? Because like you in America, you guys are having a shortage of toilet paper, right?
Yeah, you can say that.
Yeah, like that's the big thing, toilet paper. At least that's what I heard. I mean, I don't know if it's still going on.
Yep.
But I know when this whole thing came down, everybody was losing their minds about toilet paper. Well, here in Israel, it's eggs. It wasn't an issue until like I noticed like in the last week or so, you can't find eggs in Israel. Now I'm lucky enough that we have a connection, and now I understand we can still get it, but the price has gone up. The price has gone up exponentially because there's a shortage. So somebody wrote a very benign post about eggs, about what did chickens. He basically said, "What did chickens stop laying eggs suddenly?" And that's all he posted on our group. And the next thing you know, two guys started duking it out and fighting each other.
Wow.
Because one guy brought up a conspiracy theory saying, no, you know what it is? It's the government of Israel is destroying the eggs in order to drive the price up. And another guy said, oh, take your tinfoil hat off and put it over your face. Holy and cow. Shut up or something like that. And then the next guy, that guy started calling the other guy names, and they just went back and forth. And I thought to myself, do you guys not get what you're doing?
Man,
you know,
that's insane.
So So when I'm talking about this idea, how do we go from a situation of nega, a situation of being stricken, to an idea of oneg? And so Chazal in Judaism teach that the difference between they use the distinction between the disciples of Bilaam, who was the evil prophet, right? The wicked Bilaam.
Right.
They make a distinction between Bilaam, his disciples, and the disciples of Avram Avinu, of our patriarch Abraham. And they said that with the disciples of Bilaam, they had what's called ayin ra'ah, the evil eye. Ayin being eye and ra being evil. And they said, while the disciples of Avram, of Abraham, they had an ayin tov, or ayin tova. They had a good eye. And so when you're thinking about those things, ayin ra'ah and ayin tova, having an evil eye or a good eye, if we take that and we turn it into a spiritual component, then it becomes, what is your outlook? What is your perspective? So you have different types of people in the world, right? You have the people who see the glass as half empty, and you have the people that see the glass as half full.
Yep.
And this is really where you get into the distinction between this idea of nega and oneg. And so if we take it like a little step further, let's say, okay? And I'll try to put this in, kind of give it a positive spin and give you an example from the Torah. So in the Talmud, there's in Sukkah, talking about Sukkot again. So in the Masechet Sukkah, in the Talmud, it brings a position of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who we talk about a lot. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the author of the Zohar, but he's one of the rabbis that's quoted extensively in the Talmud. And he says this. He says, I could excuse the entire world for all of its sins from the day I was born until now. That sounds like a very bold statement, but Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai was considered a very big tzaddik. And basically what he's saying there is that he had such great merit, he had such great, what we call zchut, because of who he was, that he basically said that through his merit, people had the ability to be forgiven of their sins. And then he doubled down even further in that Talmud, and he says, and if you include my son, Elazar, who we often see in the Zohar, is also quoted, the son of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He says, if you put both of us together, we could both excuse the sins of the entire world from the beginning of creation until now, meaning from the beginning of creation until his time. And then, but he says, but if you add Yotam, the son of Azariah, who was one of the kings of Israel, if you included him with us, we could excuse the entire world from the beginning of time until the end of time with our combined merits. You think to yourself, wait a minute, who's Yotam and Azariah? So you would think that would be strange. All right, we say Rabbi Shimon was a big tzaddik, and Rabbi Elazar, his son, was for sure a big tzaddik as well. But Azariah and Yotam, how do we put them in the same category? What's the point of even mentioning Yotam in this? So Rashi explains that Yotam's righteousness was based on the fact that he honored his father. And we see this story in, I believe it's in 2 Kings, I want to say 2 Kings 15. We see the fact that Azariah became king, and he was known to be a righteous king in a way, but then it says that because the high places were not removed, that he was stricken with leprosy, that he became a Metzorah. And then we see that he, as a result, that his son, Yotam, who was the son of Azariah, became the kind of acting king in his place. But what we know historically, and from what we read in the Chazal, what he did was he acted on behalf of his father, but he never put the crown on his head. That everything that he did while he was the acting king, he did in the name of his father, but without any of the pomp and circumstance of being king. He didn't take credit for himself. He attributed everything related to the government to his father. And think about that. Here's his father, Azariah, who's been stricken with tzara'at. He becomes a metzorah, which means he has to be in total isolation. He can't be around anybody. We remember when we read in Vayikra 12 and Vayikra 13 and Leviticus 12 and 13 about the metzorah. And then we also can read about this in 12 and 13. I think there's a couple of other places where it's mentioned as well. The Parsha is Tazliah and also Metzorah, obviously. So you got to think that here he's sitting totally isolated by himself with this skin condition that he has, and people are probably wondering where he is and what he's doing. And he's got to be thinking about what his situation is, and certainly thinking that this is terrible and horrible. I mean, look, I said this last week or the week before. I mean, really, are things so terrible that we're going through now? What, you're stuck in the house, you're stuck with your family, you're stuck with your wife. I mean, I'm thankful to be stuck with my wife. I'm sure you are as well.
Absolutely.
We have the kind of marriages where we're not. I read an amazing thing the other day. I was shocked to learn that they said that there's been an increase in domestic violence because people are stuck in the houses with their families.
Holy cow. That's a sad thing.
It's crazy. So here's this king, right? He's a Metzorah. He's got this skin condition, and he's got to be thinking, this is terrible. What could possibly be positive about this? And yet, in all of this, we see that his son, Yotam, was so righteous that he was such a tzaddik that he became what we call anav. He became a humble person as a result of this, and he really became the personification, so to speak, of the one who honors his parent. The prophet Malachi talks about it in Malachi chapter 1, verse 6, makes mention of the one who honors his father, the son who honors his father. And this is what Yotam did. During this period of time, he basically is a person who was able to take the situation that we're talking about, and because of his righteousness, and because he didn't take the crown for himself, so to speak, he became the perfect example of what we see in Malachi 1:6, and he was able to take something that was negah, where his father was negah, was stricken, and turned it into oneg. He turned it into a situation. And this is how, if you change your outlook, if you change your perspective, where you have a situation where you're looking, you have a situation in which the glass is more than half empty, we can change it to see that it's more than half full, because Yotam became, as a result of this, changed it because of who he was and because of what his father went through. We know Tzara'at is a terrible situation to go through. a terrible plague. Anyway, so that's one thing that I see, at least related to this concept of the plague.
Okay, right.
So there are other things that we can see in this Torah portion in Ki Tisa as well, related to this situation. So like one of the things that we see in Ki Tisa is we also see, not in particular in the portion that's read this Shabbat, but because it comes from Ki Tisa, we also see in this Torah portion the Ketoret, the incense, is brought up in Ki Tisa. And we see that the Ketoret, the incense, was something that was also used to stop a plague. When the Jews were punished for the sin of the Egel HaZahav with the golden calf, with the plague, we see that Moshe Rabbeinu instructed Aharon to take his fire pan and to bring the Ketoret and to separate it between the living and the dead. And as a result, we saw that the plague had stopped through that. Let's see, where else can we go with this? So you wanted to talk a little bit about Pesach.
Right.
Okay, so we see that in Exodus chapter 12 is probably the main text of where we see at least Moshe Rabbeinu after he has the experience with Hashem at the Sneh, at the burning bush, and Hashem basically tells him that he's going to be the one to bring his people out. And then he goes and he gives them instructions in Exodus chapter 12, starting in verse 3, where he tells them when the new moon is going to come, and about taking the lamb, each one for his household according to their father's house, a lamb per the household, and giving them instructions on how to use the blood and how it's to be eaten. Now that's an important point that we have to bring up every time that we talk about this. Excuse me.
Sure.
So every time you and I discuss this, and I'm sure this is brought up by other rabbis and certainly by Rabbi Singer, that first of all, it's very important to note, as I said, why did I bring up that this was a one-time thing, that we see Pesach as kind of a separate thing from Chag HaMatzot? Not only was it a one-time thing, meaning that we have one Seder here, like I said, on Wednesday night, and then we go into the holiday of Chag HaMatzot, of the 7 days of unleavened bread. Here's another very interesting thing that people may not know. The halacha in Judaism only requires us, we usually have this happen on the radio show, right, William?
I know, right?
where we can't get words out. People will be surprised to learn, because it's called Hag HaMatzot, or it really is related to the holiday of unleavened bread, and it says to us, the law tells us that we're not supposed to have any leavening and chametz in our home during the 7 days. The halacha in Judaism only requires us to eat matzah at the Seder on the first night. There is no halacha to eat matzah the rest of the week. Now we do, but there's no halacha. There's no law that requires that I have to eat matzah for those other 7 days. What I can't do is I can't eat chametz, have chametz in my house and eat chametz, but it doesn't require me to eat matzah. So that's one interesting thing. The second thing that we have to note is that in Exodus chapter 12:14, Moshe Rabbeinu says, "This day shall be for you a memorial. You shall celebrate it as a pilgrimage celebration for Hashem throughout your generations, as a law for the end of time." It's so. What am I saying there? So when he says it's a memorial for you, not only was it a memorial for them to celebrate this, but he's giving us an instruction now for the future that what happened that night became a memorial. It's not that we now bring a Pesach, because we don't have a Beit HaMikdash, we don't have a temple. We certainly don't put the blood on the doorposts and the lintels of our house. And we certainly don't have Hashem coming through the angel of death to pass over our homes in order to bring the final plague of the death of the firstborn to the Egyptians. So what I'm saying is, when you have people that will come out and say, well, Passover is connected to the Christian Messiah, and he represents the Passover lamb. First of all, the Passover was not a chatat. It was not a sin sacrifice. And how do we know that? Because the instructions earlier we just read is that not only was the blood placed on the doorposts and the lintels of the house, but it became a family meal. The family sat down and ate it,
right,
what was left over. Now, you can try and spin this every spiritual way you want and say, oh, well, his blood and his body and the communion and everything else. It's shtuyot, it's nonsense. They didn't make a spiritual thing of this. They actually ate the lamb. It had to be roasted. There were specific instructions on how it had to be done. So you had a situation where the blood was used only to protect who? The firstborn in the house, because the plague was about the death of the firstborn of Mitzrayim. It didn't protect anybody else because it wasn't a sin sacrifice. And even if you're going to say, even if you could make the argument, which you can't, but even if you could make the argument that it was a sin sacrifice, it would have had to be brought by everybody in the house, not just one lamb for the whole household. You couldn't bring a chatat if you sinned for an entire household. If you sinned, and it was an unintentional sin, which we read about in Vayikra, you would have had to bring for the person who sinned. You couldn't bring a lamb for the whole household, and certainly after you brought the chatat to the Kohen HaGadol and to the Kohanim in the Mishkan, in the Beit HaMikdash, you didn't then go have a family meal with it. So what I'm saying is that when you tie all these things together, you can't make the argument that the Christians make related to Passover.
Right.
And also, you can't see it as anything more than now what it is, which is a memorial. When we sit down on Wednesday night here in Israel and we have a Passover Seder, what we're doing is memorializing. We're not keeping the Passover in the sense that we're offering a Passover lamb. What we're doing is we're memorializing it. Now here's the other thing. People will often use Exodus, these instructions as well, to say that the Torah is for everybody. Now, I believe the Torah is for everybody. And I think that the Torah needs to be disseminated. But to say that the Torah is everybody in the sense that you want to argue that you, William, have the same rights, obligations, and responsibilities that I have, that does not fly when you're using the argument that there's one law for the native and for the foreign.
Right.
Foreign, meaning that the people that were there, that attached themselves to the Hebrews in this idea of the Passover, that's when it's saying that there will be one law for them as it relates to the people that wanted to be attached to the Hebrew people and to come out with them and to end up going to Har Sinai and to receive the Torah. Of course, there was one law for them, but you can't make the argument now that because you are now somehow connected to Israel and you've now left idolatry or whatever it is that you've done, that now because you see in Exodus that it says there's one law for the native and the foreign-born, that means that you have the same obligations and responsibility as somebody who's born Jewish. Now, that might not be a popular thing to say, but anybody that's been listening to me for any number of years knows my position and the fact that I do teach Torah to non-Jewish people, and I do teach Kabbalah non-Jewish people, which is also not popular within Judaism. So I'm not saying that people that are not Jewish are not connected to the Torah, but I'm saying there is a distinction. When we're talking about all these distinctions, there is a distinction between somebody who's Jewish and somebody who's not Jewish. It's just the way it is. I want to see, where are we in time?
We have roughly 5 minutes left. No,
Okay.
actually, no, we can go longer because I tried to trim it at an hour for the viewers. And actually, we started late on my end, so let me see the actual timer here. I just recalled that. So we're actually about 12 minutes or so is left. So.
Okay, so anyway, so then we see in those instructions that they're supposed to take the lamb and they're supposed to take it on the 10th of the month and set it aside. And so then you have this 4-day period, because then it comes on the 14th of Nisan is when the lamb would have been offered. And we could do an entire show just on the differences in the Christian Bible as to what the different gospels say related to when this took place and when it was legitimately, could it really be considered a Passover Seder, which I 100% believe it was not and couldn't be, based on the timing of what the Christian Bible says and what the Gospels say related to when Jesus sat down with his disciples. There's no way it could have been a Passover Seder because the time doesn't match up, and he certainly couldn't be considered, also from what I remember of the timing, could certainly not be considered, couldn't be correct, because there's a dispute as to when we know the lambs were actually offered according to what Jewish law said and what the Torah said, and when it should be brought, and when he sat down and when he had his meal according to the Gospels. So you could do a whole show on that, and I'm sure Rabbi Singer has probably talked about that many times on your show.
Right.
So when you talk about this idea of this kind of lengthy time of inspection, we always have to remember that the ancient Egyptians, certainly during that time, they worshipped lambs. And so taking a lamb with the instructions that were given, which would have been considered one of the deities of the Egyptians, and taking it into their home for these amount of time, and kind of you could kind of, if you put a picture in your head, kind of tying it to the bedpost, so to speak, in the house, with the intention of slaughtering it and eating it, which we said which was going to take place, was certainly something that the Egyptians would have noticed, and certainly would have been considered very disrespectful of their deity, this lamb. So it really had to take a lot of bravery and courage on the part of the Hebrews, who had been enslaved for so long by these Egyptians, to basically stand up for the beliefs that they had and the commandment that was coming from Hashem to Moshe, through Moshe, and the danger that was possible, that could have taken place. So we see that this is considered one of the reasons, one of the merits that they had for being redeemed as well, because they did stand up to the potential danger and the potential physical harm that they could have faced as a result of disrespecting the Egyptians like this. So we could also use the example set by these Hebrews to inspire us to have courage as well, especially in the current situation that we have, in facing what we're facing and living according to the sort of principles that they showed us. We see that you could see Pharaoh. We're talking about this idea of the distinction between evil and good before. We talked about the good eye and the bad eye. We talked about looking at it from a perspective and so forth, so we can always see Pharaoh being the personification of evil in this situation. And we see that even though he tried and he tried and he tried to stand up against good. His resistance was broken, and he ended up having to chase these former slaves out of the land. And we see that they left in such a hurry that the bread that they baked as provisions for the way did not have time to rise, which is where we get the idea of matzah. And we see that 600,000, the story tells us, and our history tells us, that 600,000 adult males came out, plus many more women and children, left Mitzrayim, and other people came with them as well. And they headed towards Har Sinai, which was basically became the birth of this nation. And of course, we'll see in Wednesday night when we do the Seder, which basically means order, we use what's called a Haggadah, which means a telling or repeating. And this is the story we tell at the Seder meal, which is some of the things that, that we've talked about already. And the whole purpose of the Seder is to tell the story of our ancestors, their slavery, and their release from Mitzrayim. And there are so many other things. There are other nonverbal methods of telling the same story. We have the food items on the Seder table that tell a story as well, because they're not only about things that we eat. Each one of them symbolizes something, whether we're talking about the matzah, whether we're talking about the wine, we're talking about the karpas, which is sometimes celery or parsley, or some people use potato, the maror, which is, the horseradish, or some people use romaine lettuce, and you have charoset, which represents the mortar, which is Sephardic Jews use dates usually. Ashkenazi use apples and nuts and wine mixture, Sephardim dates and nuts and so forth. You have the shank bone, which represents the offering. You have an egg. All of these things mean something. And unfortunately, we don't have time to go into the meaning of each one of those, but even the Kabbalists go in detail about these things. I can give you a brief kind of overview. I mean, we know that the first thing that we always do is the Seder begins with the Kiddush, where we do the blessing over the wine. Right. And it's usually a red wine. Some people use white wine today, but typically there was no red wine. And you know why they only used red wine back in the day, especially when you're seeing the rabbis of the Talmud. It's because one of the things that we're accused of when you're making this distinction between Judaism and Christianity was this idea of the blood libel, that Jews were accused of using the blood of Christian children to make matzah. That's a famous thing called the blood libel.
I remember that.
And so red wine was only used, and it's only in the modern day that you see that white wine is used. And because the red wine traditionally has the connection to blood, really, but, the association with slavery and the fact that our ancestors, the Jewish people, were beaten and bloodied and so forth. So there's from a Kabbalistic standpoint, when you look at the spirituality of the wine, for instance, we know that wine is produced from grapes, and it comes from a place that's hidden within. In other words, the grape has to be crushed in order to make wine. And so there's a spirituality that's hidden. So it really speaks about the spirituality that's hidden in the physical world and then needs to be brought out. So it's interesting that the numerical value of the Hebrew word for wine, which is yayin, is the same numerical value as the Hebrew word for secret or sod. They both have the same numerical value, which gives us the idea of that secret of the physical, the spiritual that's hidden within the physical. So at the end of the day, when you have any spiritual time or event, Judaism always attaches wine in order to bring out the spiritual potential that we find in that event. And the Talmud says that when wine goes in, the secret comes out. So really for me, what I'm trying to say in all the things, I brought a lot of different concepts here. We talked about the specific verses that are brought up in the Torah that's going to be read on Shabbat. Now, unfortunately, none of us can go to Batei Knesiot, to the to shuls or synagogues. We don't have the Torah brought out because we're not allowed to have gatherings now. All of them are closed, basically. But that doesn't mean that we can't read these things. And so I think it's important to tie all these concepts together, to think about the time of redemption, to think about the difference between nega and oneg, this idea of taking something, of being stricken and turning it into joy, or what we call delight. Oneg means delight. And this idea of the physicality and the spirituality, and this idea of, we talked about sala'at, and the plague that we're going through, and this idea of ayin ra'ah, the evil eye, and ayin tovah, the good eye. That would be the thing that I would probably say is the most important thing to focus on in this time of redemption when we're talking about Passover, because it all becomes this idea of perspective, that when we're saying that spirituality is hidden in physicality and that spirituality needs to be brought out, it all becomes, what is going to be your outlook? What's going to be your perspective? Are you going to be like those people that are bringing up conspiracy theories? Are you going to be the type of people that when somebody asks a simple question about what did chicken stop laying eggs, that suddenly you're going to start attacking the other person and calling each other names and being nasty? Or are you going to take the step back and realize that there's a reason? It's not so terrible that we're all in isolation during Passover. It's almost like, without being able to bring the lamb as an offering, we've been put in a situation like the ancestors did when the Hebrews came out of slavery, when they had to be in the houses alone, only with their family, because the plague was going to come to strike the Egyptians. So let's not be like the Egyptians. Let's be like the Hebrews, that were brave and had courage and were willing to stand up to those forces of evil and not succumb to it and not fall into despair, but trusted in Hashem and knew that Hashem was going to bring redemption at a certain time. Let's not be like those people who are always falling back. It seems like we always do that. I think, and I'm not the person to say this, but I think that we really are on the cusp of something very big. Am I willing to say that we're in the days of Mashiach, or that Mashiach is coming in, like some people say? No, but I'm saying we're on the cusp of something very big. Hashem is giving us an opportunity here, and I think that we need to take it.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, indeed. Well, looks like we are definitely out of time now. So, Rabbi, thank you so much for covering all the details that we were trying to hit. And I hope everybody has a great Pesach. And I'm not sure, are we going to be on next Sunday? When is actual Pesach on our calendar?
On your
as far as yours, more. I mean, I can kind of fluctuate, but you can't. So.
Yeah, no, I mean, I will let you know, but okay. It shouldn't be a problem doing Sunday night.
Okay, great. That sounds good. That
doesn't affect us. It's Chol HaMoed. It's not. It's not the last day of Chag. So.
Okay, very good. All right, that sounds good then. Rabbi, thank you again for your time.
My pleasure.
You bet. And thank you too. And all you viewers out there, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel, turn on notifications. On your screen, I put up some counter-missionary work here from Rabbi Tovia Singer, Jason LaCrosse. We've got Rabbi Stuart Federow and also James Wood Jr. Great resources. Even if you're Jewish, this is important information that you could use to be well educated whenever somebody approaches you. Rabbi, you were going to say something?
Yeah, one more thing. But before I go, I just want to let people know if they're interested on Tuesday nights or Tuesday night my time. So it'll be about 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'm doing a Zoom doing the basics of Kabbalah. I started last week, but people can catch up if they want to. I'll post it on Facebook and social media. So if people are interested in that, that'll be on Tuesdays.
Awesome. Thank you, Rabbi. All right.
Mm-hmm.
Have a great week, guys. See you. Bye.
אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד איפוק זו העוצמה ויתור זו הגדולה השאיפה והכמיהה אני אתה אתם תמיד תמיד כולם ביחד חשוב מכל חשוב והכרחי להיות ביחד איפוק זו העוצמה ויתור זו הגדולה השאיפה והכמיהה חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים זה טבעם של אנשים שונים נזכור בסוף כולנו שותפים חשוב תמיד להיות אנושיים חושבים דוברים לובשים בכל האופנים זה טבעם של אנשים שונים נזכור בסוף כולנו שותפים חשוב תמיד להיות אנושיים אני אתה